This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our supporters at patreon.com and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Mean Girl, Ayn Rand and the Culture of Greed by Lisa Duggan. Ayn Rand's complicated notoriety as popular writer, leader of a political and philosophical cult, reviled intellectual, and ostentatious public figure endured beyond her death in 1982. In the 21st century, she has been resurrected as a serious reference point for mainstream figures, especially those on the political right, from Paul Ryan to Donald Trump. Mean Girl follows Rand's trail through the 20th century, from the Russian Revolution to the Cold War, and traces her posthumous appeal and the influence of her novels via her cruel, surly, sexy heroes. Outlining the impact of Rand's philosophy of selfishness, Mean Girl illuminates the Randian shape of our neoliberal contemporary culture of greed and the dilemmas we face in our political present. Mean Girl, Ayn Rand and the Culture of Greed by Lisa Duggan. Out now from University of California Press. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. I don't have time for a super involved intro today, so I'll just say this. DSA's explosive growth continues. It's already, in a few short years, become the center of a renewed American socialist movement. My guest today, Doug Henwood, has lots of thoughts on what's happening with DSA and why, because he recently published a lengthy article in the New Republic entitled The Socialist Network, Inside DSA's Struggle to Move into the Political Mainstream. Before we get rolling, this is a straightforward request for your support at patreon.com/thedig. If you listen to this show regularly and can afford to contribute a few bucks a month, please do so. It's the support of listeners precisely like you that allows us to provide all of our episodes for free to those who can't afford to support us. And if you donate $10 or more, we will send you left-wing book swag in the mail. We have a lot of good books to send you. That's patreon.com/thedig. I get an email every time a new contribution is made. So if you've been meaning to contribute but haven't gotten around to doing it, make my day a joyous one by ensuring this podcast's long-term survival at patreon.com/thedig. Thanks, and here's Doug Henwood, an economic journalist and host of the weekly Jacobin radio show, Behind the News, which originates on KPFA Berkeley. His books include Wall Street, How It Works and For Whom, and My Turn, Hillary Clinton Targets the Presidency. He published Left Business Observer from 1986 to 2013, and he is now engaged in a study of the rot of the American ruling class. Doug Henwood, welcome to The Dig.
It's good to be here.
This is really overdue because I don't know if I've ever told you this, but in many ways, this podcast is very much modeled off of your podcast, of which I'm a longtime listener.
Oh, well, thank you. I feel like I've helped spawn a whole generation of young leftists who can reap, all the glory that those of us who kept the flame alive during the dark days didn't get in very large quantities.
Proud to be a spawn. A general question before we get into a lot of specifics. What is DSA, and why has it very quickly become not only the largest socialist organization in the U.S., but also the primary organizational point of reference for this bigger thing that's happening when socialism is all of a sudden a real force in American politics for the first time in a long time?
DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, goes back, I believe, to the early 80s, a product of a merger between Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which was founded by Michael Harrington, and the old DSA reflected a lot of Harrington's politics, which were social democratic. There's a lot to admire about Michael Harrington, but he also had his limits. He's kind of anti-communist, rather infatuated with taking over the Democratic Party, and there's a sort of Cold War-ish feel to DSA that put people like me off for a long, long time. And it remained rather small, and going into the period of just before its great explosion in membership, it was fairly old membership. It was almost a naturally occurring retirement community. Although the young wing, the young DSA people, often had much livelier politics and interesting conferences. I spoke at a few of those way back when, but then the grown-up, that was like the youth contingent, but then the grown-ups had really fairly tedious politics, and there was almost a morbid, morose quality to it. And then somehow...
And I don't think I was even aware of DSA really when I got involved in the radical left in the 1990s. I mean, not only was, there were left things happening at that time, like the anti-globalization movement, but organized socialists as a whole were not even really at the center of that. And DSA wasn't even one of the groups I was aware of as being in the mix.
No, I mean, they had, I guess their membership was probably larger than the ISOs, but I think the ISO, since given all its activity on campuses, which was much more visible. Somehow, the founding of Jacobin magazine, 2011, really sort of kickstarted some interest in socialism among a younger demographic. People started trickling into DSA at that point. Bhaskar Sankara joined, I think, when he was in the year between high school and college. But it was still quite small. And then it was the Sanders campaign that really got things rolling. The whole Sanders somehow created this awareness about socialism. It had not really previously existed beyond a very small network of fairly marginal groups and people. That brought in thousands and thousands of new members. And then AOC's victory brought in another wad of members.
And also Trump's victory, because while Bernie highlighted socialism, Trump highlighted barbarism.
Yeah, I think so. That old alternative, socialism or barbarism, acquired new life. And I think like things like the airport occupations just after Trump announced his immigration restrictions also really helped kickstart the membership. So it went from, I think, just under 5,000 to where it is now, 56,000 in a couple of bursts. And they're almost, it's almost like a geological exercise. You can there's like generations of membership in DSA now. There's the pre-Jacobin crowd, which is fairly small and now fairly vestigial. There are the people who joined during the Jacobin years, like 2011, 12, 13.
Which is sort of around what was called the Left Caucus at the time.
Yeah, and there's some of those people who joined then were really actively trying to push DSA to the left. Their caucuses then went through a series of evolutions,
which we'll get to later a little bit.
Yeah. Then there, of course, are the people who came in during after the Sanders and AOC campaigns and the great anxiety around Trump. But there's a weird kind of almost generational conflict within DSA that takes form of various caucuses within the organization. I don't want to exaggerate the disputes, but they are somewhat significant. And but there's people now who are in their earlier mid-30s feel like they're senior citizens within the organization because when I go to a meeting,
I can attest to that as a 36-year-old.
Oh, okay. I was wondering how old you were. Yeah, I mean, when I go to meetings at the North Brooklyn branch, I'm a member of. It's I don't know, 25, 27 seems to be the median age. I don't know, something like that. And almost no one. I have a friend who's been sort of one of my guides in DSA, who's 51. She says she feels like a senior citizen. And there's almost no one between the age of, 35 or under the age of 35, that's at all visible in DSA.
Well, as a quick aside, when I was at a Sanders kickoff event in my neighborhood, just to kind of see what the early stage organizing looked like, and there were a ton of young people, 18 or so through maybe early 30s, and then a decent number of pretty old people as well, which is not like DSA, but then no one in between. Yeah,
well, I think that's true of a lot of left politics in general. That there's just baby boomers who remember the '60s, and then the vast gap that occurred for the next couple of decades.
The Gen X wasteland.
Yeah. My wife, Liza Featherstone, once thought of doing a blog called "My Crappy Generation." Because they're just very apolitical cohort that is now largely sort of escaping all this kind of generationally oriented commentary that is proliferating.
So what made DSA the ready organizational container for this historical moment that emerged, given all of the organizations that are out there? Is that due in significant part to the work that the Left Caucus was doing to move the organization to the left? Because it seems unlikely that energy would have gone towards an organization that looked a lot like the one that Michael Harrington initially built.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of theories on that. One is actually people just heard Bernie Sanders talk about democratic socialism. They Googled it and found DSA.
I don't doubt that.
So I think that may be part of the story because, going into that membership explosion, even with that generation, the Jacobin generation coming in, it was not really a vital organization. A lot of the old guard was really kind of sticking to the old Harrington way of doing things. So, yeah, I think it just was there. I don't know exactly what precisely was the magic that attracted all these hordes of young people to DSA, but it's been a remarkable explosion in membership.
The DSA of old was in many ways, as you mentioned, focused on realigning the Democratic Party. In other words, taking it over. Today's DSA is certainly notable compared to other socialist groups for its openness to running candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line. But today's orientation isn't, generally speaking, about realignment. It's something a lot more instrumentalist. What is DSA's approach? Obviously, there's no monolithic approach, but what is, generally speaking, the approach, and what's its track record been?
This article I wrote for the New Republic was commissioned when the editors saw some Facebook posts I'd made that wondering if DSA could accomplish with the Democratic Party what the conservatives did with the Republicans. And
the Buckleyites.
There's this a fairly famous quote from Ronald Reagan talking to CPAC in 1976, where he said, can we turn this from a party of pale pastels into something more brightly colored? And that was just kind of like middle of the right's real big move into the Republican Party. I was a conservative my early years in college. I was a member of the Party of the Right at Yale in 1971. And there were about a dozen of us. It was really strange. People thought we were odd. Conservatism seemed dead. And then 10 years later, Reagan was elected president. So I'm just looking back at that trajectory. I was thinking, wow, can we do the same thing on the left now? So I was wondering precisely what the strategy was in the relationship of the DSA and what indeed people in it were thinking about long-term strategy. I did about 35 interviews for the piece, and almost everyone agreed that the Democratic Party was indeed a capitalist party. A lot of far-left critiques of DSA, Trotskyists in particular, like to say, well, all these DSA people are running as Democrats. Don't they understand that the Democratic Party is a snare and the death of all kinds of social movements?
Yes.
Well, in fact, they do understand that, but it's a very instrumentalist view of the Democratic Party. It's a vehicle to rent and not own. The American ballot law makes it nearly impossible for a third party to get anywhere near a ballot, even if you can get on. I mean, the dominance of the two-party system is so profound, not just organizationally, but ideologically as well, and habitually. It's almost a reflex. Which party you in? There's only two choices. It's really, really hard to develop anywhere outside of that two-party system. Seth Ackerman wrote a piece for Jacobin a few years ago, in which he proposed something not unlike the strategy that DSA is following, that you can have a party outside the two-party system that sort of functions as a party, but in fact is not electorally a party, that can then run, maybe as a Green sometime, or maybe as an independent, but also as a Democrat. And I think we've seen a bunch of candidates from DSA running as Democrats at local level, mostly so far. But even Sanders himself, never been a Democrat, actually ran as an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party, and coming from Vermont in 1980. So he's never been a member in any sense of the Democratic Party. But you can just, if you get enough, you can enter a primary and run, or if you can get enough petitions signatures, you can enter as a Democrat, even if you've got no long-time relationship with the party. But this is the weird nature of the American political party, is that it's not what is conventionally understood as a party in the rest of the world. These are membership-based organizations with ideologies and programs and some kind of policy and membership discipline. There's nothing like that in our party systems. At the very top there are these big fundraising mechanisms and fund distribution mechanisms, but anybody can run as a Democrat. If I wanted to run as a Democrat for, in my district in Brooklyn, Chuck Schumer couldn't stop me. The party can put its thumb on the scale, as it did in the case of the Sanders campaign, but they couldn't stop him from running as a Democrat and actually disrupting the Democratic Party in ways that obviously make Nancy Pelosi very uncomfortable. That look on her face the morning after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat Joe Crowley in the primary. I mean, she looked shell-shocked and confused. She didn't know what to say or do. It's not her party entirely anymore, and the Democratic leadership is still trying to figure out what to do about that. So, yeah, the idea is that the party is something to use, that the ballot line is a great asset that cannot be easily duplicated, but that doesn't mean you have to genuflect in the direction of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi all the time.
Well, it's an irony that the two-party system simultaneously makes it very difficult, in many cases totally impossible, to compete with either of the two major parties externally as a third party, but it's incredibly vulnerable internally.
Yeah, the political scientist Adam Hilton has written on this, and he says that the party structures in the U.S. are rather porous and flexible. So the Republican Party does sometimes exhibit a considerable degree of party discipline. Mitch McConnell runs his Senate pretty strongly, but on the other hand, they had that Tea Party rebellion a few years ago, which was half a grassroots thing and half a phony thing. But they did manage to enter primary people they thought of insufficiently conservative, and really push the party to the right. I think we're seeing something not exactly parallel, but something reminiscent with this move of the left within the Democratic Party. It's causing leadership a good deal of consternation, and to watch mostly orthodox presidential candidates have to pretend that they're for Medicare for all. They're coming up with these sort of Medicare for some schemes, but they have to pretend. And you have somebody like Kamala Harris having to say that she's not a socialist. The Bush advisor Matthew Dowd once said, "If you argue against us while using our language, we're winning." And I think we're seeing, we're not, I wouldn't say the left is exactly winning, but it's certainly moved the polls of the debate substantially to the left. And it's just a remarkable thing to watch in such a short period of time.
And Sanders, as you mentioned, is really a model for this instrumentalist approach. You write, quote, "Sanders would have been a marginal curiosity had he run as an independent." And this is something I know well as an unrepentant Nader 2000 activist. I was 17 years old. I'll never apologize for it. But it's very clear retrospectively, like what approach terrified the corporate Democratic establishment more, Nader's or Sanders?
Well, they're still complaining about Nader, and they're still complaining about Jill Stein now. Somehow Jill Stein is what delivered Donald Trump the presidency to some of these lunatics. But just parenthetically, Nader, given his prominence, and he did many admirable things over the years. But he had these three kind of chimerical presidential campaigns and left nothing behind. He was he's deeply hostile to building institutions. He ran as a Green. He could have built that party, given his name recognition, but he didn't. So we don't really know what the Green Party could have become had Ralph Nader devoted some of his energies to building that as anything but just a vanity vehicle for his presidential runs. But the Greens have been at it in many states for a long, long time, and they still are barely holding on to their ballot status. In New York State, which has probably the worst election laws in the country, you have to get 50,000 votes for your gubernatorial candidate to stay on the ballot, and they really have a hard time doing that. We've seen people run as Greens for city council in New York. You'd think that a city council race is fairly achievable. It's not on the scale of even a House campaign, but it's nearly impossible for a Green to do that too. So it's they've been trying for a long time and failing, and the Greens will always complain, somewhat like the Trotskyists do, that the DSA people are falling prey to the evil seductions of the Democratic Party, but there's not much of an alternative. It's a horrible thing, and I hope we could change the electoral law and get all kinds of different, proportional or ranked choice or all these other schemes for opening up the ballot. But as long as we're in this institutional structure that we're in, it's really hard to think of an alternative to the Democratic Party as a vehicle, not as something to hitch your wagon to. My friend Draka Larimore Hall, who is vice chair of the California Democratic Party, and a serious socialist and a member of DSA for a long time, wants DSA people to become Democrats formally, and there's some kind of structure within the California Democratic Party that would allow for a kind of socialist caucus within the California Democratic Party, and a lot of the positions of that party are very progressive, at least on paper. But I brought that possibility up to a lot of people I talked with, and there's just no interest at all in getting that close to the Democratic Party, because I think
Never.
It's a contagious or communicable disease, I guess, to get too close to it.
Well, I get why the left's instrumentalism bugs Democrats, but it's sort of like tough shit, because the dynamic is the fault of a two-party system that we hate. It's not like we were like, oh yeah, we'd rather not have our own party, and we'd rather just take over yours instead.
Yeah, and if you enter something like that, who will take over whom? I mean, that's why this studied distance that people have been keeping with the party is really so far proving a fruitful strategy. Who knows how it will work out over the longer term? But for now, it's very promising. And
look at Chicago.
Yeah, well, that's an amazing thing. 6 city council members out of 50 are now DSA people. That's over a tenth of the Chicago City Council is self-identified socialists. And I talked to Rosanna Rodriguez at some length when I was working on the piece, and she is the real thing, and very, very impressive. To have somebody like that in the city council of Chicago is. 5 years ago, one couldn't have imagined it, but here we are. And I have to wonder. I always used to think that having a Democrat in the White House was better for the left, because you could say, see, even with a Democrat in the White House, some things still really suck. And that was Gary Will's explanation of why the 60s exploded, was that during the 50s, all these Democrats and liberals would say, it's just Eisenhower. If we could only get a Democrat in the White House, everything would be so much better. And then JFK got in, and things weren't better. And so people were open to more radical alternatives.
And LBJ unleashes mass murder across Southeast Asia.
Yeah. And then there was, I think, a mini echo of that in the 90s with the growth of the anti-globalization movement in Seattle and all that stuff, too, that, Bill Clinton, after all those years of Reagan and Bush, we thought we finally got a good Democrat in the White House, and he was just terrible. And so people were willing to look at more radical alternatives. But now, I don't know. I really wonder if, had Hillary Clinton won in 2016, would we be seeing this? I kind of think not. I think
there's no clear rule here, because Bush was horrible for the left.
Yeah, the combination of the Sanders campaign plus Trump. Trump is so appalling in so many ways. that I think it shocked a lot of people into wanting to do something. Whereas, I don't know, a Hillary presidency could have just provoked a shrug of resignation. And just, here we go again.
In sum, Susan Sarandon was right.
Well, I know I can get crucified for saying that, but we really have to think seriously about whether that's the case or not. And I never told it. I wrote an article for Harper's denouncing Hillary. That turned into a little book denouncing Hillary, and but I never told anyone not to vote for her. I completely understand the lesser evil strategy up to a point, but maybe I was wrong. And that's one issue for DSA, though, and people who are playing this electoral game from the left. When the right was on the rise, they had no qualms about running spoiler campaigns. When Bill Buckley ran for mayor of New York City in 1965, he did so in part to destroy the liberal republicanism that John Lindsay represented. And he didn't care if that would deliver the election to a Democrat. He was much more intent on destroying the liberal Republican tendency. You can even think of the Goldwater campaign. They were very happy to run what turned out to be a losing campaign, a massively losing campaign, because they thought it would build
in '64.
Yeah, their power over the longer term. And Goldwater got hammered, but 16 years later, Ronald Reagan was elected. So there's this willingness to take electoral risks with extreme positions that the right exhibited in its rise to power. And I'm not sure that people on the left would want to duplicate that. Chris Mazzano, who is on a Jacobin person and also on the National Political Committee of DSA, I asked him about the spoiler strategy, and he said a lot of people on the left are afraid that if a Republican wins, it will just damage poor people in ways that distress them immensely, and they wouldn't want to pull use the spoiler strategy.
And that's true. The right doesn't have to worry about harming poor people because they don't care about poor people.
No, they don't. But they, on the other hand, they also have. This is one thing about the right-wing strategy that I really envy, and I'm not sure that we have anything comparable on the left. But if you go back to the late 40s with the funding of the Mont Pelerin Society, and then the Koch brothers starting in the 70s, these people had a real disciplined long-term strategy for taking power. They had a really clear vision of what they would like the world to look like and how to get there. I saw one comment, I quote this in the article, I can't remember, it was a scholar who was writing about Milton Friedman, I can't remember his name, but he remarked on how Friedman was just an amazing mixture of an idealist with a really long-term vision. At the same time, he had a real good sense of how to get involved in practical politics on a day-to-day level. I'm not sure we've got anything like that. I'm not sure we have either the vision of what we would like to see in the long-term society to look like, or really how to get there. It's much more of a pragmatic, experimental thing. And there's this tendency on the left that has lingered since the 60s and is stepping away from or hostility towards Leninism, of anything that looked like organizational or ideological discipline. It's like that way lies authoritarianism, the gulag. And the right was never shy about that and frankly, used Leninist strategies. I mean, a lot of the people who engineered the right-wing takeover of the Republican Party came out of communist and Trotskyist backgrounds and were quite willing to redeploy the organizational skills that they learned during those days to manage their takeover. For people on the left who are shy about that kind of ruthlessness, I don't think we can duplicate that kind of success. And I do worry about that as a longer-term challenge for our people. We just don't have that clear view of what society should look like or how to get there.
Well, I do want to talk about some of the internal debates over ideological and political discipline within DSA, but first we should point out that electoral politics is just one part of DSA, and in many chapters, a rather small part. Here in Rhode Island, there's an eco-socialist campaign against the utility national grid. Other chapters are organizing tenants or encouraging members to join critical industries like logistics and transportation. How do you see electoral politics and these sort of like issue-based grassroots organizing campaigns relating to each other in the various ways that they do all over the country.
Yeah, I went into researching this piece, thinking that in some sense, this is a common view on the far left, that electoral politics and isn't real politics. Real politics is organizing people for more transformational ends than just electing a candidate. So I did subscribe to some degree that there was an opposition between these two practices. In talking to people who are deep into DSA, it came clear to me that these are not at all in opposition. That, for example, the Sanders campaign, very electoral, but it did bring in a whole lot of people interested in campaigns beyond that election. The campaigns at the local level for city council in Chicago fed on other kinds of organizing work, but also built it. So if you come into these kinds of electoral campaigns from other kinds of politics and with a sense of you'd like to do other politics beyond the electoral, then these things can be synergistic. They can feed each other so that you can have an organization, a tenants organization that gets involved with some campaign to have somebody better in the city council. So when you have a tenant grievance, you can have somebody who'll listen to your arguments in a position of power. But then, once you've got that candidate elected, you also have to organize to keep that candidate honest and push the kinds of issues that you elected that candidate to promote. So, yeah, there's
and to back those candidates in fights with other elected officials who are hostile to
the
the agenda.
Yeah. And, and I interviewed Julia Salazar, who is a DSA member who was elected to the state senate in New York. And she said her very presence in the state senate has enabled some of the Democrats there to bring out their inner leftist in ways that didn't exist before. She said that they saw that she managed to get elected without real estate money by actively spurning real estate money. And in New York politics, real estate is just so profoundly important. It's probably the most dominant single sector in state politics. The fact that she was able to get elected by spurning real estate, running against real estate, inspired them to maybe, vote for some tenant protections, which are up in the state senate this year. There can be an effect beyond just getting your own candidate elected. You can also just, change the nature of the body beyond your particular set of candidates. These things are not in opposition, and that people there are different emphases. Certain groups are more likely to push the electoral campaign. Some people are likely to organize outside the electoral realm, but very few who take an either-or attitude towards it.
You write that DSA is quite different from the median socialist group you've encountered during your decades on the left and in the political wilderness, that despite all the drama one hears about, that the internal vibe is actually pretty good mostly.
Yeah, there are a couple of chapters around the country that have had problems, really serious disputes, civil wars almost. But that doesn't seem to be the dominant mode at all. And, in New York, which is famous for being cantankerous and difficult, everything I've seen is there's stuff going on under the surface, yeah. But, everything I've seen is pretty collegial. I go to these chapter meetings and people treat each other with respect. There's no weirdness and hostility that you would see in left organizations in the 80s and 90s. It has an entirely different feel, like people working together in common purpose with a genuine experience of comradeship. Now, who knows if it can last, but I found it, for some of my generation, used to a whole lot of really dysfunctional and hostile kinds of organizations. See this kind of collegiality and decency. It's really inspiring. I hope it can continue. Who knows? This organization has grown from tenfold in the space of a couple of years. So anything like that is going to have some growing pains, but it seems to be doing pretty well to me.
Yeah, and I think it's just important to convey, if we haven't enough already, for younger listeners and those newer to the left, just how marginal socialists were until very recently. Not just socialists, but the left as a whole, even through its big moments, like the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s, turn of the century.
Well, yeah, quite a lot of those movements, I felt like a real dinosaur around those people, because I think a lot of them were pretty hostile to the idea of socialism. It seemed statist and, bureaucratic and top-downish. So there's the this strong anarchist quality to it, a lot of that stuff. And they just, I felt like the Leninist dinosaur in those kinds of groups. You just didn't use the word socialist. You never heard the word socialist. I remember talking to Joanne Landy at a conference, probably about 15 years ago, and she said, I'm a lifelong socialist. I'm afraid to use the word. And I remember that same feeling. You just felt so bizarre using the very word. And it's just so strange to me now that Gallup was out the other day with a poll showing 42 or 43% of Americans saying that they like socialism in some sense. It's not clear what they mean by that, but it's a remarkable change that the word has lost all its toxicity that it once had, even on the left, which, like I said, was often anti-socialist.
Well, in the anti-capitalist left of the late 90s that I was involved in as a teenager, the way that I typically encountered a socialist organization was a member of one of many small organizations attempting to sell me a newspaper, including or like denouncing Noam Chomsky outside of a speech he was about to give because of some bizarre miscontextualization of something Chomsky had said once. And it was not very attractive.
There was also, that was the days when the ISO was trying to take over things. So it developed a bad reputation. I mean, it does. And I don't mean to diss the ISO. There's a lot of things I respect about that former organization, but it did create this bad vibe for young activists in those days who saw the ISO and similar like Leninist organizations, democratic centralist organizations, as secretive and manipulative and devious and ambitious.
Well, for all the ISO's failings, there were far, far weirder, more problematic groups out there in the late 90s.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's the Spartacus League, of course, which was my favorite. I just love reading Workers' Vanguard for years and years because it was such an entertaining combination of tabloid sensibility with rigid Leninist Trotskyist politics. But half their efforts seemed to be devoted to attacking the ISO as fake socialists or fake Trotskyists. They actually would reprint their opponents' attacks on them in a series called Hate Trotskyism, Hate the Spartacus League. So that kind of weird. This is an organization with maybe 50 members, And then they had, they would have schisms, like the 1917 Bolshevik tendency crowd split out of the Spartacus League over something or other, and they would have
if people think Twitter is bad, it's just
the Bolshevik tendency used to have a table at the Socialist Scholars Conference, which I think are only like 2 members of it. But most of their literature was about attacking the Spartacus League. It's so delightful to see all that stuff recede from view and see a real serious, radical but engaged in the real world kind of movement that DSA represents.
Including the entry of a lot of great organizers from ISO, which had a lot of people involved with it that I truly admire.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's great to see those people now in DSA and bringing their years of experience. And ISO was founded in the late 70s, and their lifespan coincided with pretty much with the most marginal period in the history of the American left.
Reaganism and Clintonism.
Yeah, and they were fighting a good fight, but badly outnumbered, and no one really knew what to do at that point because you just felt so weird and outnumbered and obsolete. So I don't want to spend too much time criticizing. They did a lot of good work, and I admire a lot of what they did. And it's great to see some of their people now in DSA and bringing new life to a socialist, helping bring new life to this socialist movement.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our supporters at patreon.com and by the Socialism 2019 conference, which is taking place this July 4th through 7th in Chicago. Socialism 2019 is the largest socialist conference in North America. Join hundreds of other activists, organizers, and socialists fighting for the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, and organizing their workplaces and social movements. Participate in panels and discussions on Black feminism, radical film, reparations, Palestinian liberation, and the socialist case for open borders. Speakers at Socialism 2019 include Naomi Klein, David Harvey, Astra Taylor, Amy Goodman, Anand Gopal, Francis Fox Piven, me, Dan Denver, and many more. Teacher strike leaders from the past year will come together at the conference with other teachers and union organizers to share experiences, inspire, and strategize. Socialism 2019 conference is organized by Haymarket Books and Jacobin and is endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America. Visit socialismconference.org to register today. That's socialismconference.org. And make sure to register before May 31st for the early bird discount rate. So we have rightly and importantly emphasized the general good vibes going on, but there are debates and, as you've alluded to, even some drama. Some are differences in emphasis, and some are at a more core strategic and ideological level. There are different approaches to organization and structure between local organizing and focusing on national issues like Medicare for All. There's differences over electoral politics and Bernie. And there's a lot of space for these kind of differences because DSA is both heavily decentralized in terms of the relationship between the national organization, which is run by the National Political Committee, and local chapters. And so there's just this incredible number of tendencies compared to maybe any other American socialist group ever. I don't know. But my question is, what are the major points of differences within the organization?
Yeah, well, I guess the biggest bone of contention, or the biggest attraction and detraction, is this group that originated as that Jacobin generation in DSA, the Left Caucus, that went through any number of metamorphoses and is now known as Bread and Roses, also previously known as Spring and Momentum. And a lot of people outside that caucus really are very suspicious of them. They view them as kind of closet Leninists, plotters who want to take
and
over. And
heavily associated with Jacobin,
yes.
not for no reason.
Yes, and the combination of there's 6 or 7 of them on the National Political Committee. They don't have a majority, but that is it's the most dominant single force on the National Political Committee. They have Jacobin, a lot of substantial overlap between that caucus and the Jacobin editors and contributors. And
though not entirely, I'm a member of no particular caucus, and Thea, my partner, is affiliated with Socialist Majority. So it's still,
which caucus?
Still a multi-tendency publication.
Which are you in?
Socialist Majority. Oh, no, Thea is Socialist Majority. I'm no caucus at all.
Oh, yeah, I'm no caucus either. But anyway, I think there's a lot of, they get a lot of unfair press. They are very contemptuous of horizontalism, like all those kind of Occupy anarcho tendencies that were prominent in that, the Occupy phase of the American left, believe in some kind of organizational and ideological focus. They don't believe in this prefiguration that we want to create the society we want to live in with our little park encampments and things like that. They really are organized to push their line within DSA and elect their people to positions of leadership. And some people outside the group see them, like Leninist plotters and, secretive and centralizing and all those things. There's also a lot of disagreement around whether they're class reductionists or not. I think that's kind of an unfair rap. They in their principles, they talk about the various oppressions besides class, race, and gender, and sexuality, and private sexual identification, gender identification. They do probably emphasize class in that kind of Jacobin way more than a lot of people are comfortable with, but I think they're also unfairly caricatured as being indifferent to non-class forms of oppression.
You write that people are both critical of them kind of unfairly, and also the sort of premise of their approach that DSA is too wildly horizontalist is also kind of unfair. That was your sort of assessment.
This is one of the problems I have with all these caucuses, that you find more differences within the caucuses than you might expect, but also fewer differences between them than you might expect. And I'm not sure that the caucus structure does anything but accentuate those differences. And I think several of the other caucuses were founded to be the not Bread and Roses or the not Momentum. I think that's some people think that's the major reason for a socialist majority to exist. But they also, some people think that Bread and Roses is too ideological, too Marxist maybe, too much like older styles of socialist organization. A lot of the people who came out of the ISO have gravitated towards Bread and Roses. I guess they feel more at home in that kind of more disciplined approach. On the other hand, Bread and Roses' view of the rest of DSA is that they're not a bunch of Occupy hippies. They're not about to go camp out in parks and prefigure their new society through their drum circles and all that. I mean, it's like
camping out in parks for recreational purposes exclusively.
Yes, fun. Yes, Bread and Roses. We do like both Bread and Roses, but the conflicts between Bread and Roses and everyone else really, when they came to a head in a couple of local chapters. One is the Philadelphia one, and the other that is got the hottest internal fights is the East Bay caucus. Yeah, I really paid most of my attention in researching this piece to what was going on in Philadelphia, and it was
because it ultimately, the local drama in Philly ultimately blew up what was the Spring Caucus. We're getting into deep inside baseball now, but I know some listeners will appreciate this. It ultimately blew up the Spring Caucus, and it was because of Philly DSA, which has a ton of local drama around structure and also its leadership's hostility to so-called identity politics. It ultimately showed, ironically, that the Spring Caucus is not quite the class reductionist caricature. They have a different way of analyzing these things than I do, but they're not quite what people maybe thought they were because they basically kicked out Philly.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a bunch of people around Philly. I spent some time talking to one of the leaders of the dominant faction there, Dustin Guastella, but also a lot of the people in the dissident crew, Lilac. And a lot of the complaints were that the dominant crew, which were Momentum members, really had a very strict view of class-first politics. They thought that anything that addressed race or gender was divisive and almost like the slippery slope to neoliberalism. And certainly, the Hillary Clinton campaign has a lot to answer for, but that the way those mainstream Democrats have cynically used race and gender to discredit the left has been very, very damaging. But we shouldn't pay them the credit of actually taking them seriously. And
yeah, it doesn't mean that racism and sexism are not extremely pervasive and even fundamental to the operation of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about material reality, the organization of labor markets, the distribution of property, race and gender figure very importantly in those things. There's nothing diversionary or secondary about that at all. But the Philly leadership really thought so, and I'm sad to say that someone I've known and admired for many years, Adolph Reed, has had a very strong influence on that group. That any attention to race and gender is the road to Hillaryism. It's been very distressing to watch this play out in Philadelphia. There was this famous review that one of the members of that group, Melissa Natchek, did of Assad Haider's book, Mistaken Identity. And it was, I thought, a really dishonest piece of hack work. But it was all the result of an internal fight within the Philly DSA chapter over whether to have a reading group based on that book. And the leadership didn't even want to have a reading group based on that book. It's like, so if you've got the leadership forbidding people from reading books, it's just not a very good look. They're also they didn't want to get involved in local politics. They wanted to subordinate everything to the Bernie campaign and Medicare for all. There were promising possibilities for elections to the Philadelphia City Council that the chapter didn't want to get involved in. I talked to one woman who was running for the city council who was trying to get their endorsement and couldn't even figure out what the process was for getting it.
And this is a city where Larry Krasner was elected DA, where there's a big, vibrant left outside of DSA that's been pretty effective at getting results.
Yeah, and there are 2 seats in the city council reserved for members of the non-dominant party, which would mean somebody who's not a Democrat. So that would be a opening for DSA to run sort of independent candidacy and establish itself and some sort of pre-party formation or whatever. But they were not interested in that either. It was all about Bernie, and they would manipulate the agenda so that things couldn't be discussed or discussed only at the last minute, or things would get postponed. Getting involved in anything non-electoral too, like tenant organizing or anti-gentrification efforts or anti-racist or anti-police brutality efforts. Those were all seen as distractions and marginal. And it was getting really, really quite ugly. The leadership of what was then Momentum was quite distressed by what was going on. I said spring. I keep losing track of all their rebirth names. And they eventually just basically reformed the organization so they could purge the Philadelphia crew. And so from what I hear now, that there's not much going on in the Philadelphia caucus, which is unfortunate given what a lively left there is elsewhere in that city. And I guess some of the people objected to my writing about this because it was a distract. It was just like gossipy was one criticism I got from a Bread and Roses member on Facebook. But I think it did sort of purify to some kind of toxic essence the nature of that tendency and these kinds of fights. These are things that have plagued the left, for 100 years at least. The questions of centralization versus decentralization, of spontaneity versus organization, is how focused to be on class issues versus other things. These are real issues that people disagree on, but it just reached such an extreme in Philadelphia that it was.
It's not gossip.
No, it's not.
It's the politics of an organization that's politically important.
Yeah. Everything about this is really important. Like, how do we organize these things? How much discipline do you have as an organization? DSA's charter prohibits people from joining who are members of democratic centralist organizations. Okay, we don't like democratic centralism in DSA, but then just how disciplined should we be? How rigorous should the enforcement mechanisms for chapters and members to follow the party line? You don't want to be so loose as to be fly apart and be completely ineffective. But you don't want to be so tight that you end up as rigid and marginalized and dead. So these both the ideological and organizational questions are really, really serious and important, and things that need to be worked out over the longer term with DSA. Like the Sanders campaign. There's some people, and this is the line of Jacobin magazine now. It seems as well as the Bread and Roses tendency. Really want to put a lot of eggs in the Bernie basket. I have some reservations about this. It's quite possible he may not. I think it's unlikely he's going to win the Democratic nomination, but he might not even do that well in the primary campaign. So I'm concerned about getting too deeply involved in the Bernie campaign. A lot of the people who support that idea think that it does a lot of magic. It draws people into the movement. It will be good for the long-term development of the socialist movement in the country. I hope so, but I don't know, maybe not. Or Medicare for all. Like in New York State, there's a campaign for a state-level Medicare, which is economically feasible and not politically impossible, but there are some people within the New York DSA who don't want to get involved in the state one. They want to get involved in the national one. But national Medicare for all, given the structure of the U.S. Senate and certainly even the House of Representatives at this moment, is impossible to imagine it's passing nationally, which doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for the long term. But if you go look at the state level, California, New York, these are real possibilities of having some kind of state level single payer plan. So how much effort do you put in fighting for that versus fighting for the national one? How much effort do you put into city council campaigns versus the Sanders presidential campaign? Real questions that no one has really figured out the answer to yet.
Looking forward to the convention in August, what should DSA members and fellow travelers who are listening be expecting?
Well, I don't know. I'm curious about how many of these fights are going to come out into the open. Well, perhaps they should come out to the open, but how collegial will they be? Will the collegiality of the organization survive that convention? I don't know. We'll find out. We'll find out some of these the sentiment around a lot of these organizational and political questions of how much discipline, how should we allocate our efforts, who's going to get elected to the National Political Committee, what kind of tendencies will be represented. I think it's very much up in the air. We don't really know. And most members, I think, are detached from all these caucus struggles. Most members are not in caucuses. Most of the caucuses have only a few hundred members.
Most are involved in concrete local work.
Yeah. And, how will they come together? How will they compare notes? And I think having, a nationally coordinated organization that is also deeply involved in local struggles is a great model for how to do politics. I once heard a talk about the evolution of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. And Sweden, a very small country compared to the United States, but even there, they started at the lowest levels of politics and worked their way up to build the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. That's one of the things that makes me nervous about putting too much emphasis on the Sanders campaign. The presidency is the bourgeoisie's office. I mean, it really is a tough nut to crack, whereas all kinds of people get into city councils or state legislatures. That's a rich area of possibility. And the right has been very skilled and strategic about targeting state legislatures. The Koch brothers and ALEC have been funding state-level legislation and state legislative candidates for a few decades now, and making a big difference. The state legislatures draw district boundaries. The states themselves can pass legislation that has a tremendous effect, especially if it's nationally coordinated in the way that ALEC has been doing. All these abortion laws that are being written, the criminalization of dissent that we're seeing in a whole bunch of states now, ALEC legislation. So we need to take these state-level races very, very seriously, and the focus on Bernie at all expenses, I think, would marginalize those state-level campaigns. So, and I think this will probably come out at the convention. Maria Svart, the director of DSA, says that she likes the caucuses because they bring those differences out in the open. I hear a lot of other people complaining that they just lead to division. And, a lot of the reaction to my piece coming from members of the various caucuses focused on just what I said about their caucus, not what, the 200 words I might have said about their caucus rather than the 5,300 other words I said about the national organization. So there is a certain degree of caucus narcissism that gets stimulated that may not be very productive.
I thought a really positive thing about your piece was that it talked about some of these difficult controversies and debates that are pretty well known within DSA, but not so much externally. But in doing so, showed that there was actually that these debates revealed that there was a lot of consensus within the organization. Like spring caucuses attacked for being class reductionist, but when it came down to it, they separated from Philly DSA, but precisely because they were committed, actually, maybe not with the same analysis I have, but to also fighting racism and sexism, and that's normal in the organization.
Yeah, that was one of the points of contention with the Philadelphia crew, who objected to that language in their national platform because it was, too identitarian. And, God, that word really needs to be put out to pasture. It's just, there are a whole lot of complicated issues that really need to be worked out there. And this dismissive use of identitarian is just really bad. And we need to put that away. Yeah, I think there's almost like a marketing need to accentuate. If you have a caucus, you need to accentuate your brand, and you accentuate your brand by exaggerating the differences between you and everyone else. And I'm not sure that is really a great impulse for an organization like DSA, which is young and vigorously growing, but we don't know where it's going to go. We want to help this thing stay together and not fly apart on the basis of internal dissension. And the reaction that I've got for some of the caucuses that seemed like symptoms of caucus narcissism were not inspiring. But on the other hand, like I said, very few members of DSA are in caucuses. I think that the non-caucus caucus is the largest of all.
Well, Doug Henwood, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Doug Henwood is an economic journalist and host of the weekly Jacobin radio show Behind the News, which originates on KPFA Berkeley. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week, sometimes, like this week, twice. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Julia Rock. Our managing editor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, also, please leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What also does that is you telling other people about the show. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this thing up and running strong. Even a few bucks is a huge help.